cold didn't touch her skin, it went for her lungs. Each breath scraped on the way in, dry, bitter, tasting of ash and iron, like the forge had died and left its bones in the air for her to swallow. Abigail kept her breathing shallow, but it changed nothing. The air still settled in her chest, heavy, unmoving, heavier than pain. The forge behind her was black, not dim, not fading, gone. Soot clung to the stone, the faint outline of heat still lingering like a memory that refused to admit it was over. But the fire, the roar, the breath, the life of it was finished, completely. She sat where it used to burn, where he used to stand. His boots had pressed the ground into something solid, something certain. His hands had shaped iron into things the town depended on, whether they bothered to say it or not. Now there was nothing. No hammer striking. No sparks cutting through the dark. No voice filling the space between blows. Just the quiet. And it wasn't empty. It pressed in from every side, from the walls, the floor, the dead forge at her back, a weight without shape, enough to make each breath feel earned. Outside, someone laughed, casual, unaware, and that was worse, because it meant the world hadn't stopped. Only hers had. They had called her a burden long before the fire went out. Too big, too slow, too much of everything that didn't fit neatly into a life someone else could respect. The words hadn't come sharp. They had settled, layer by layer, like soot, until they clung to her the same way the ash now clung to the stone. Her hands rested in her lap, broad, calloused, worn thin in ways no one had ever bothered to see. They trembled, not from weakness, but from holding still against everything pressing in. Slowly, almost without thinking, her fingers reached across the cold ground until they found it. The hammer. Too heavy, they had said. Her grip tightened anyway. She didn't lift it. Not yet. But she didn't let go. And somewhere behind her, in the dead space where heat used to live, the air shifted, just enough to make the silence feel watched. By morning, the forge was no longer hers. Not on paper, not yet, but in every way that mattered. You could feel it in the way people gathered too close to the doorway, in the way their voices carried without lowering, as if whatever stood inside had already been emptied of her. Abigail remained near the entrance, shoulders squared, out of habit more than strength, her hands hanging at her sides, broad, still, useless in the eyes that watched her. The hammer rested inside where she had left it, but she hadn't touched it again, not with all those people waiting to see her fail before she even tried. They didn't look at her the way they used to. There had been a time, small and unspoken, when she belonged to the place. Not respected, not truly, but acknowledged. The blacksmith's wife, the one who carried water, who steadied iron, who moved in rhythm with a man who knew what he was doing. That had been enough then, enough to pass without comment, enough to exist without being weighed. That ended with him. Now the looks came different, slower, measuring, as if each pair of eyes was calculating how much of her could be taken before nothing remained worth noticing. The words followed, not loud, not sharp, just certain. Shame about the man. Forge won't last. She can't swing a hammer proper. They drifted through the air and settled where the last had already made space, layering, thick as soot, until even silence began to carry their shape. Abigail kept her gaze low, fixed on the dirt where boot prints overlapped and erased one another without thought. It was easier there, easier than meeting eyes that had already reached their conclusion. Her breath stayed shallow, controlled, not from calm, but from restraint, like something inside her had learned the cost of making itself heard. The sound came before the man, the steady strike of a cane against wood, slow, deliberate, each step placed with the kind of certainty that didn't rush because it never needed to. The crowd shifted without being told, space opening, bodies angling aside as he approached. Mr. Helver stepped forward clean and composed, his coat untouched by dust, his posture untouched by effort, as if the world had always arranged itself to meet him halfway. "Mrs. Abigail," he said, voice smooth, even, not raised, yet somehow heard by all, his eyes passing over her without stopping, as if looking directly required more interest than she warranted. "I trust you understand why we're here." The word "we" settled heavier than anything else. Abigail swallowed, her throat dry, her voice rough when it came. "It ain't settled. Not yet." A thin smile touched his mouth, gone almost before it formed. "No," he agreed, tapping the cane once, a soft, final sound. "Not yet. But I find it useful to prepare people for outcomes they're not equipped to avoid." A murmur followed, low, approving, the kind that hid behind stillness but didn't bother denying itself. He stepped closer, measured, unhurried, each movement controlled. "You've had time," he continued, his tone almost patient. "Time to consider your position. Time to recognize your limitations." His gaze settled fully on her now, moving from her face to her frame without disguise. Not cruel, not angry, simply assessing, and already finished with the result. "You cannot maintain this place. You do not have the strength, nor the discipline, nor the capacity to carry what it demands." The agreement in the air thickened, unspoken but complete. "I can learn," Abigail said, quieter now but steady, the words pulled up from somewhere deeper than fear. "I've been here. I know the work." Helver exhaled softly, something like amusement crossing his expression before it flattened again. "Knowing the work and doing it are not the same," he replied, lifting his cane and gesturing toward the forge behind her. "Tell me, how long before that fire dies completely? A week? Perhaps less?" No one answered, not because they didn't have an answer, but because they didn't need to say it out loud. He stepped closer still, close enough that the clean scent of him cut through the ash and iron, clinging to everything else. "Look at you," he said, softer now, forcing the crowd to lean in without moving. "You struggle to carry your own weight, and yet you expect this town to believe you can carry a forge?" A few laughs slipped free, quick, sharp, gone almost as soon as they appeared, but not before they landed. Abigail's fingers curled into her palms, nails pressing deep, anchoring her to something that hadn't given way yet. She didn't lift her head. She didn't trust what might happen if she did. Halver let the silence stretch, let it settle, let it become something final, before reaching into his coat and drawing out a folded sheet of paper. He extended it toward her, steady, certain, as if the outcome had already been written long before ink touched the page. "I'll make this simple," he said, his voice returning to that quiet certainty. "You sign, and you walk away with what dignity remains. Or you don't, and we proceed in a manner far less forgiving." The paper hung between them, light in his hand, heavy in the space it occupied. All she had to do was take it. The paper never reached her hand, not because she refused it, not because she stepped back, but because something in the air shifted before the moment could close. It was small at first, easy to miss if you weren't listening for it, the faint drag of a boot across wood, the subtle change in the way the space held its breath. Then it settled, heavy and undeniable, like the ground itself had decided to take notice. No one spoke, not at first. They felt it before they understood it. A presence that didn't ask for room, didn't wait to be acknowledged, just arrived and made everything else adjust around it. Abigail's fingers hovered inches from the paper, her hand stalled mid-reach, not from hesitation this time, but from something colder, sharper, pulling her attention elsewhere. She didn't turn quickly. Nothing about this moment moved fast. Her head lifted, slow, the same way something lifts when it knows it has already been seen. He stood just inside the doorway. Tall wasn't the word for it. Tall was something you measured. This was something you felt. His shoulders filled the frame, broad enough to block the light behind him. His outline cut into the space like a mark that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. Dust clung to his coat, not brushed away, not hidden. His boots carried the road with them. Everything about him looked used, worn, tested, and still standing. Elias. The name didn't pass through the crowd out loud, but it moved anyway, carried in the tightening of shoulders, in the way men who had been leaning forward a moment ago now found themselves still, careful, unwilling to be the first to move. He didn't look at them, not once. His eyes found Abigail and stayed there, steady, unreadable, not soft, not kind, but something worse for the men gathered there. Level. Equal. As if what stood before him required no adjustment. Halver noticed the shift before he turned, his fingers tightening just slightly on the paper, his posture holding, but not as easily as before. "This is a private matter," he said, without raising his voice, though something in it had changed, something thinner, stretched. "I suggest you mind your place." Elias didn't answer. Not right away. He stepped forward one pace, then another, each movement quiet, controlled, the floor taking his weight without protest. The distance between them shortened, not fast, not aggressive, just inevitable. He stopped near the anvil, his hand moving without hesitation, reaching for a length of steel left abandoned in the dark. He set it into the coals, stirred what little heat remained, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a dull glow. Faint, but alive. The sound of breath returned to the forge in that instant, low, subtle, but enough to change the air. Elias waited, patient, until the color deepened, until the metal caught the light properly, until the red came through like something waking under pressure. Only then did he lift it, place it on the anvil, the contact ringing out sharp and clean, a sound that cut through every whisper still clinging to the room. He picked up the hammer, not the smallest, not the one set aside for lighter work, the heaviest one. It sat in his hand like it belonged there, like weight was something he didn't measure. The first strike came down hard, not wild, not rushed, precise. The sound cracked through the space, a single note that carried more force than any voice in the room had managed all morning. The second followed, then the third, each one steady, controlled, turning heat into shape with the kind of certainty that didn't ask permission. Only then did he speak. "Step away from her." He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The hammer came down again, the steel bending under it, the sound landing in the chest more than the ears. Halver didn't move, not yet. "This does not concern you," he replied, sharper now, the edge showing through. "You have no claim here." Elias lifted the hammer once more, then let it rest, the head lowering slowly until it touched the anvil, with a quiet, final weight. His gaze shifted then, not wide, not searching, just enough to land on Halver. That was all it took. "You're standing in a place built by a dead man," Elias said, his voice even, low, carrying without effort, talking like you're the one who decides what it's worth. He paused just long enough for the words to settle where they needed to. "Take one more step toward her, and I'll show you exactly how little that paper weighs." The room tightened. No one laughed this time. No one moved. Halver held his ground, but the certainty in him had thinned, pulled tight across something less stable. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, the question controlled, but no longer casual. Elias tilted his head slightly, not in challenge, not in mockery, just enough to make the answer unnecessary. His hand shifted on the hammer, not lifting it, not preparing to strike, just adjusting, like a man who understood exactly what he was holding. "I don't repeat myself," he said. Silence followed. Heavy. Complete. The paper in Halvor's hand no longer looked light. It looked fragile. For a moment longer he held it there, suspended between decision and retreat. Then slowly, carefully, he lowered it, folding it back against his palm as if sudden movements might change something he no longer controlled. "This isn't finished," he said, quieter now, not to the crowd, not even to Elias, but to the space itself, as if reminding it of something that might still return. Then he stepped back. One step, then another. The crowd followed his lead without being told, the pressure breaking, the gathered weight of them thinning as bodies shifted, turned, found reasons to leave. No one met Abigail's eyes as they passed. No one spoke. The forge emptied the way it had filled, slow, uncertain, leaving behind only what had been there all along. Abigail stood where she had been, her hand still half raised, the space where the paper had been now empty. Her chest rose, fell, the breath coming different this time, deeper, though no lighter. Elias set the hammer down. The sound was softer than before, final in a different way. He reached for the heated steel again, turning it once, checking its shape, as if the interruption had never broken the rhythm, as if the work had always been the point. Only then did he speak, his voice quieter now, meant for her and no one else. "Don't cry," he said, not unkind, not gentle, just certain. Steel doesn't come from comfort. He stepped aside just enough to clear the space before the anvil, just enough to leave a place where she could stand. "I'm not buying a servant," he added, almost as an afterthought, though the words carried weight all the same. "I'm settling a debt for someone who shouldn't have one." The forge waited. So did he. And for the first time since the fire had died, the choice wasn't being taken from her. It was being handed back. They left before the town could remember how to speak again. No farewell, no last glance traded for closure. Abigail didn't turn back, not because there was nothing to see, but because she knew exactly what she would find if she did. The same door, the same faces, the same weight waiting to settle back onto her shoulders the moment she hesitated. So she didn't. The road out of town wasn't much of a road at all, just a stretch of worn dirt cut thin between dry grass and stubborn earth, the kind of path that only existed because enough people had chosen it over time. By midday, even that began to fade, swallowed by open land that stretched without promise in any direction that mattered. Elias walked ahead, not far, never close. His pace didn't change to match hers, didn't slow, didn't push, just remained steady in a way that made distance feel like something she had to negotiate on her own. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't anything at all. Just a fact she had to learn how to carry. Abigail followed. At first, she counted steps. Not on purpose, it just happened. Something to anchor her breath, to give shape to the stretch of land that didn't offer much else. 10 steps, 20, 50. Somewhere along the way she lost track, and the silence took over where the numbers left off. It wasn't the same silence as the forge. This one didn't press in. It opened, wide, endless. The kind of quiet that made a person aware of how small they were inside it. Wind moved through the grass in long, low passes, whispering without words, bending the land just enough to remind her that nothing here stood still unless it chose to. The sky hung high and empty, too clean, too vast, offering no edges to hold on to. She wasn't used to it. The town had always made room for her by pushing in, by narrowing, by reminding her of every inch she took up. Out here, there was no boundary to measure herself against, only distance, only space. It made something inside her uneasy. Her boots dragged more than she liked, each step heavier than the last, the weight of her body no longer hidden by walls or work or expectation. Out here, there was nothing to break it up, nothing to distract from the simple fact of it. Too big, too slow. The words came back without invitation. She didn't speak them, didn't need to. They had already learned how to repeat themselves. Elias didn't look back, not once, but he noticed. That much became clear the moment her steps began to lag too far behind. He stopped, not abruptly, not with any sign of impatience, just enough that the distance between them stopped growing. He didn't turn around. He didn't call her name. He simply waited. Abigail closed the gap on her own. By the time she reached him, her breath had turned rough again, her chest tight. Not from the cold this time, but from the effort of keeping pace with something that didn't bend. He moved again the moment she was close enough. No acknowledgement, no instruction, just forward. The land began to change as the light shifted. The open stretch gave way to rougher ground, scattered stone pushing up through the dirt, forcing each step to be placed with more care. A line of trees appeared in the distance, thin at first, then thickening into something that broke the horizon. By the time they reached it, the sun had started its descent. The air cooled fast. Different from the forge. Cleaner, sharper. It cut without clinging. The trees swallowed sound in a different way than walls ever had. The wind lost its voice between the trunks, reduced to a low murmur that followed them without direction. The ground softened underfoot, dirt giving way to fallen leaves and old roots that caught at her boots when she wasn't watching. Abigail stumbled once. Not hard, just enough. Her foot caught on a root hidden beneath the leaves, her balance shifting forward before she could correct it. Her hand shot out instinctively, finding nothing but air until it hit something solid. Elias's arm. He didn't grab her. Didn't steady her in any way that could be mistaken for help. He just stood there, unmoving. Enough for her to catch herself against. She pushed away the moment she found her footing, breath tight, something sharp rising in her chest that had nothing to do with the fall. "I'm fine," she said. The words came out too fast, too defensive. Elias glanced at her then, brief, measuring, not doubting, not agreeing, just taking in what stood in front of him. Then he looked ahead again and kept walking. That was all. No correction, no reassurance, no judgment. And somehow, that made it harder. They walked until the light thinned into something colder. The trees closed in tighter the deeper they went, branches reaching across one another like old hands that had forgotten how to let go. What little sky remained broke into narrow strips above them, fading from pale gold to a dim, uncertain gray. The ground turned uneven, roots twisting through the soil, stones jutting up where the earth had worn thin, each step asking more of her than the last. Abigail's breathing grew louder in her own ears. Not uncontrolled, but harder to ignore. It filled the space between footsteps, a steady reminder of effort, of weight, of the distance still left to cross. Her legs ached, not sharp, not sudden, but deep, the kind of ache that settled in and stayed, building with every step until it felt like something she had always carried. She didn't ask how much farther, didn't ask where they were going. The questions sat there, ready, but something in Elias made them feel unnecessary, or worse, unwelcome. He moved like a man who had already measured the journey, already decided what it required, and saw no reason to explain it. So she followed. The silence between them shifted as the hours passed. It wasn't empty anymore. It had shape now, defined by the rhythm of their steps, by the space he kept, by the absence of anything offered or taken. It forced her inward, back into the places she had spent years learning how to ignore. Too big. Too slow. The words came again, quieter this time, not spoken, not heard, just present, the way a scar sits under skin long after the wound is closed. Out here there was nothing to argue with them, No walls to push against. No work to drown them out. Just distance. Just time. Her foot slipped once on loose stone, her balance shifting before she caught herself. This time she didn't reach out. Didn't look to see if he had noticed. She steadied, adjusted, kept moving. The rhythm broke, then found itself again, slower, heavier, but still forward. Elias didn't stop, but he didn't pull away either. The distance between them held, fixed, as if measured against something neither of them had spoken aloud. By the time the trees began to thin, the light had dropped low enough to turn everything flat. Shadows stretched long across the ground, blending into one another until depth became harder to read. The air carried a sharper edge now, biting clean through the warmth she had built from walking, settling against her skin with a clarity that made the fatigue underneath it harder to ignore. Then, something changed. Not in the land, in him. His pace slowed, not enough to call attention, just enough that the shift could be felt. Abigail noticed it the way you notice a change in wind, subtle but certain. He angled slightly off the path, if it could still be called that, and moved toward a break in the trees where the ground dipped low before rising again. She followed without question. At the top of that rise, the trees opened just enough to reveal it. The cabin. It sat alone, set back from the clearing as if distance itself had been built into its walls. Rough timber, weathered hard, edges worn by years that hadn't asked permission to pass. Smoke did not rise from it. No light marked its windows. It didn't look abandoned. It looked waiting. Abigail slowed without meaning to. Not from fear, from recognition. Not of the place, but of what it asked. This wasn't the town. There would be no eyes here to measure her, no voices to define her, no place to hide inside the shape of someone else's expectations. Only the work, only herself. Elias reached the door first. He didn't hesitate, didn't check the structure, didn't test the handle. He pushed it open and stepped inside as if the space had never stopped belonging to him. Abigail remained outside for a moment longer. The air had gone still. Even the wind seemed to pause at the edge of the clearing, unwilling to follow. Her chest rose, fell, the breath steady now, but heavier in a different way. Not from the walk, from what waited beyond that doorway. Too big, too slow. The words surfaced again, but this time they didn't settle the same way. They hovered, uncertain. She looked down at her hands, dirt-streaked, calloused, steady despite the ache running through them. Hands that had held more than the town had ever chosen to see. Hands that had not let go of the hammer, not even when everything else had been taken. Abigail stepped forward. The ground didn't shift beneath her, didn't give. The distance closed in 2 strides, and then she stood at the threshold, the dark inside stretching out ahead, quiet, contained, waiting in a way the forge never had. She crossed it. Inside, the air held a different weight, not pressing, not empty, just still, like something that had been left alone long enough to forget interruption. The space was sparse, functional, nothing wasted, nothing softened. A table, a stove, tools set where they could be reached without searching. Elias had already moved to the far side of the room, setting something down, not looking at her, not watching to see if she hesitated. He assumed she wouldn't. That landed heavier than anything said so far. Abigail stood just inside the door, the last of the light falling behind her, stretching her shadow forward across the floor until it met his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the door closed behind her, and the world she had known didn't follow. The fire didn't come back easily. It resisted, like something that remembered being abandoned and had no reason to trust the hands trying to wake it again. Elias didn't explain. He didn't need to. He set the wood, adjusted the coals, left the flint within reach, then stepped aside, not far, not watching, just present in a way that made it clear the space was no longer his to fill. Abigail stood in front of the forge. Different forge. Same silence. Her fingers hovered over the tools, not touching, not yet, the memory of another place pressing up through her hands, uninvited, unwanted, but there all the same. The smell wasn't the same here. Cleaner, less buried, but it carried enough of the old to pull something tight inside her chest. She exhaled, slow, then reached. The first strike of flint sparked weak, a brief flash, gone before it could matter. The second caught, then died. The third held, barely. A thin thread of heat curled into the wood, uncertain, flickering like it wasn't sure it wanted to exist. Abigail leaned closer, careful, controlled, feeding it small, measured pieces, not rushing, not forcing, just giving it something to take. The flame grew, not fast, not strong, but steady. She stayed with it, adjusting, watching, learning its rhythm the same way she had once learned another, long before the world decided she wasn't meant to keep it. The warmth built slowly, pushing back against the cold that had settled into her bones, not driving it out, but reminding it that it wasn't the only thing that could stay. Elias moved once, just enough to place a length of steel beside her. Nothing more. No instruction, no correction. The message was clear. If you're going to stand here, work. Abigail picked up the tongs. The metal felt different in her grip, familiar, but heavier now, as if the time away had added weight to everything she thought she knew. She adjusted her hold, testing it, finding the balance again through feel rather than memory. Then the hammer. It waited where he had left it, not offered, not handed, waiting. Her hand closed around it. The weight pulled immediately, dragging at her wrist, her shoulder, reminding her of every word that had ever been said about what she could not carry. For a moment, it almost slipped. Not from weakness, but from the hesitation that came before it. Too heavy. The thought came fast, automatic. She tightened her grip, lifted, not high, not strong, just enough. The steel went into the fire. Time passed without shape. Heat built, slow and stubborn, the color shifting inch by inch until the dull gray began to glow. Faint at first, then deeper, richer, the red pushing through like something waking under pressure. Abigail watched it, not rushing, not guessing, waiting until the change felt right instead of looking right. Then she pulled it free, set it on the anvil, raised the hammer. The first strike missed. Not entirely, but enough. The hammer glanced off the edge, the impact weak, unfocused, the sound dull instead of sharp. The vibration ran up her arm, jarring, breaking what little rhythm she thought she had. She reset, adjusted, struck again. Closer. Still wrong, too slow, too uncertain. The steel cooled faster than she worked, the color fading before the shape had time to change, the opportunity slipping through her hands with every second she hesitated. She cursed under her breath, low, sharp, not loud enough to carry, but enough to cut. Elias didn't step in, didn't correct her stance, didn't tell her what she was doing wrong. He just watched. Not closely, not critically, just there. That was worse, because it meant every mistake was hers. No one to blame, no one to adjust for, just her. Again. She shoved the steel back into the fire, harder this time, the movement edged with something tighter, something closer to anger than anything she had allowed herself since the forge went cold. The flame responded. Not to her mood, to her movement. It caught the metal again, the color returning, faster now, brighter, as if heat, once given a reason, didn't need to be convinced twice. Abigail waited, breathing steadier now, deeper, matching something in the way the fire moved instead of fighting against it. She pulled the steel out again, set it down, lifted the hammer. This time, she didn't hesitate. The strike landed. Not perfect, but true. The sound rang different, cleaner, sharper, the metal answering in a way it hadn't before. She struck again, faster, building a rhythm not from memory but from reaction, each movement correcting the last without thinking it through. Her arms burned, quickly. The weight that had felt impossible minutes ago now demanded more, each swing pulling at muscle that wasn't ready, wasn't trained for this pace, this repetition, this refusal to stop once it had started. She kept going. The steel bent, slight, but real. The shape changed under her hands, not by much, not enough to call it mastery, but enough to prove that it could, that she could. Her breath broke. Not from fear, from effort. She forced it back into control, grounding it between strikes, refusing to let it take over, refusing to let the rhythm break again. Too big, too slow. The words came back, quieter now, less certain. She struck again, harder. The hammer didn't slip this time. The hammer didn't slip this time. It landed, rose, landed again, each strike pulling harder through her shoulder, into her back, down through her wrist until the ache spread wide and hot, no longer separate from the work, but part of it. The steel answered in small ways at first. A flattened edge here, a cleaner line there, nothing graceful, nothing finished, but enough to prove it was listening. Abigail kept her feet planted. That mattered more than the swing. She felt it now, the way balance started before the hammer ever rose, the way the body had to decide where the force would go before the hand could deliver it. Too much in the wrist, and the blow turned clumsy. Too much in the shoulder, and the weight dragged her offline. It had to come from lower, from the ground, from the legs, from the stubborn center of her that had spent years carrying more than anyone gave her credit for. She adjusted, not because anyone told her to, because the metal demanded it. The next strike rang truer, then another. Heat flashed dull red beneath the head of the hammer, the steel soft only for a breath before it began to resist again. She learned quickly that hesitation was its own kind of failure. Miss the window, and the metal hardened. Lose the rhythm, and the work turned against you. So she stopped chasing perfection. She chased timing. Lift, strike, turn, strike, reset, back to the fire. The motions began to thread together, awkward in places, rough in others, but no longer strangers to one another. Sweat gathered first at the base of her neck, then along her spine, trapped beneath fabric, turning the cold air of the cabin sharp against her skin whenever she shifted. Her arms trembled every time she returned the steel to the coals, but the trembling had changed. It was no longer hesitation. It was labor. Real. Unhidden. Elias said nothing. He moved around the room once or twice, no more, gathering tools, setting things where they belonged, feeding the stove enough to keep the cabin from going hard and dead with cold. But he did not interfere. He did not lean over her shoulder. He did not correct her grip or take the hammer from her hand the moment fatigue made itself known. He let the work speak first. That, more than kindness ever could have, felt like respect. Abigail drew the steel from the fire again, its color deep now, rich and dangerous, and set it on the anvil with more certainty than before. The hammer rose higher this time. The strike came down cleaner. The rebound traveled through the handle and into her palm so hard it stung, but she didn't lose hold of it. She struck again before the shock could settle, then again, each blow finding more of the shape hidden inside the metal. Her breathing roughened, but it found the rhythm too. In through the lift, out through the strike. Again, again, again. By the 10th swing, her shoulder burned. By the 20th, it throbbed. By the 30th, the muscles along her forearm had tightened so badly she could feel the strain clear into her fingers. Still, she kept going. Not blindly, not to prove something to the room, to finish the heat she had been given. When the steel cooled, she knew it before the color fully faded. The hammer told her. The sound told her. The resistance under the blow thickened, hardened, turned stubborn. She fed it back into the fire without pause, already learning what could be forced and what had to be timed. The hours passed that way, not counted, but hammered into her all the same. At some point, the skin along the base of her thumb split. It happened quietly. A sharp pull, then warmth. She barely noticed until the handle darkened where her blood touched the wood. She stopped then, not because the pain was new, but because it wasn't. It felt old the moment it arrived, like one more thing the work had been waiting to take. She looked at the break in her skin, then at the hammer, then back to the fire. Elias crossed the room. Not quickly, not with alarm. He reached for a strip of cloth from the table, held it out once, and waited. Abigail took it. No speech, no warning to rest, no soft concern to make the moment smaller than it was. She wrapped her hand tight, the cloth biting against the rawness, tied it off with her teeth, flexed once to test the grip, then reached for the hammer again. Only then did Elias nod. Small, barely there, but real. It landed in her chest harder than praise would have. The next length of steel went into the fire, then another. He did not choose easy pieces. He chose honest ones, bars thick enough to demand force, stubborn enough to punish indecision. Abigail understood the meaning of that without needing it named. He wasn't sparing her. He wasn't setting her up to fail either. He was treating her like the metal, as something that could take heat, pressure, and shape if it stayed under the hammer long enough. The thought steadied her. She lifted again. The pain in her hands deepened as the skin beneath the cloth rubbed hot and wet. But she learned how to hold through it, how to shift the handle just enough to spare one part of her palm and sacrifice another. Her lower back ached from standing over the anvil. Her thighs burned from bracing. Her shoulders felt packed with stone. Yet beneath the strain, something cleaner was building. Capacity. Not sudden, not miraculous. Earned, one blow at a time. The sound of the forge changed with her. Earlier, each strike had carried doubt in it, a dullness, a break between intent and impact. Now the ring sharpened. The blows met square more often than not. The pauses shortened. The anvil no longer seemed like a thing she was borrowing from. It began to answer her, like a partner that had finally learned her weight and stopped resisting it. When she missed, she recovered faster. When the steel rolled, she caught it. When the heat started to run, she adjusted before it was lost. The cabin filled with the smell of coal, iron, sweat, and something else beneath it all, something faint but rising, the scent of effort turning into skill. Elias fed the forge once while she worked, sliding more fuel into the bed of coals without a word. Later, when she reached automatically for the tongs she had set too far from the anvil, she found them already repositioned within easy reach. He hadn't announced it, hadn't turned the gesture into instruction. He had simply seen what the work required and made room for it. That, too, was respect. Abigail drew another heated bar free and set it down. This time she knew what she wanted from it before the hammer rose. Not perfectly, not in the fine detail a master might see, but in direction, in purpose. The first strike set the line. The second deepened it. The third corrected the drift. Sparks leapt at the fourth, brief and bright, snapping against the dark before vanishing into nothing. She didn't flinch. The hammer moved as if it had begun to understand her, or maybe she had begun to understand it. Either way, the distance between intention and action had narrowed. Too big, too slow. The old words returned once more, but now they sounded far off, like voices heard across weathered boards from a room she no longer stood inside. She felt the size of herself differently here, not as failure, not as excess, but as leverage, as grounding, as mass behind the blow. What they had called burden, the Forge translated into force. A different truth took shape in her body before it reached her mind. The weight was not the problem. The weight was the power. She struck hard enough to draw a clean bend through the steel and held there for half a breath, staring at what her hands had done. It wasn't elegant. The edges were rough, the symmetry imperfect. A smith in full command would have seen 100 flaws. But it was shaped, and she had shaped it. Something moved in her chest then. Not lightness, not relief, nothing so soft. It was steadier than that. A hard, quiet thing, like the first true coal catching under ash. Elias stepped closer. Abigail looked up, expecting correction, expecting him to take the piece and point out where it had gone wrong, where she had failed to see what still needed doing. Instead, he lifted the steel from the anvil, turned it once in the light, and set it back down. Again, he said. Just that. Not dismissal, not mercy, permission to keep going. Abigail tightened her hand around the hammer, felt the pull in her shoulders, the split skin, the ache in her back, the sweat cooling on her neck, and lifted anyway. Outside, the dark settled over the clearing, thick and complete. Inside, the forge burned hotter. And for the first time since grief had knocked her to the floor and left her there, Abigail stood over fire, iron, and pain, and did not break. The cabin sounded different after work. The forge had its own language: heat, iron, force, the clean violence of things being shaped before they cooled. But once the hammering stopped, another kind of quiet settled in, lower and more intimate, built from smaller sounds. Fire shifting in the stove, wood easing under old weight, the faint scrape of metal set back in place. Nothing wasted, nothing loud. A house with no patience for noise that didn't earn its keep. Abigail sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a tin cup gone warm from use rather than heat. The ache in her arms had deepened now that she was still. It lived in her shoulders, in the base of her neck, in the long muscles along her back. Her palms throbbed beneath the cloth, each pulse a small reminder that the day had taken something from her and left something else in its place. She didn't know what to call that something yet. Not strength, not peace, something harder to name. Elias moved near the stove, quiet in the way only a man long used to his own company could be quiet. He cut salt pork into thick pieces, set a pan on the heat, and waited without fidgeting, without looking for ways to fill the silence. When the fat began to render, it answered with a low crackle, rich and sharp, the smell pushing out into the room until it reached her where she sat. It hit harder than she expected, not because it was hunger, though that was there too, deep and sudden now that the work had ended. It was memory. Her mother standing over a skillet with her sleeves rolled high, flour on her wrists, the stove throwing a dry warmth into a winter kitchen so small you could feel another person breathe from across it. Abigail had been a girl then, already larger than the others, already learning how to fold herself inward before the world could do it for her. Her mother had noticed. Never said much, just slid an extra biscuit onto her plate one night and murmured, "A body built to carry ought not apologize for taking food." The memory landed soft. That made it dangerous. Abigail lowered her gaze to the cup and held it tighter, as if that might keep the room she had lost from opening too far inside her. Elias said nothing at first. He turned the meat when it needed turning, not before, set coffee to warm, reached for a heel of bread and cut it with the same precision he used for everything else, as if even plain hunger deserved to be met properly. Then he glanced at her hands. "Let me see," he said. The words were simple, but Abigail stiffened anyway. "It's nothing," she answered, too quick. Elias didn't argue. He just stood there, one hand resting near the table, waiting in the same unmoving way he did when he meant to outlast resistance rather than push through it. That calm was harder to fight than force would have been. Force, she understood. Force gave you something to brace against. This just sat there, steady, until the excuse in her own voice started to sound thin. Slowly, she set the cup down and unwrapped the cloth. The skin at the base of her thumb had split deeper than she'd let herself notice. The heel of her palm was rubbed raw. Small flecks of soot had settled into the edges of the torn skin, dark against the red. Elias took one look, then crossed to the shelf, returning with a basin, clean water, and a small tin she hadn't seen before. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. No hesitation, no ceremony, just the plain fact of a man tending what needed tending. Abigail laid her hand in his, because there didn't seem to be a decent way not to. His grip was careful, but not delicate. He held her hand like he held a tool that mattered, firm enough not to drop it, steady enough not to misuse it. The water stung the moment it touched the torn skin. Abigail drew a sharp breath through her nose and tried to pull back on instinct. Elias held on. Not tighter, just enough. "Stay with it," he said. She did. The phrase should have been about pain, but it landed somewhere else entirely. Stay with it. As if pain was not always the thing to flee. As if sometimes the only way through a thing was to remain long enough for it to finish saying what it came to say. He cleaned the cuts without wasting movement, wiped away soot, pressed salve into the split skin, then wrapped both hands in fresh cloth with the efficiency of someone who had done this work on himself more than once. His own hands bore the proof of it. Up close, she could see the pale ridges crossing his knuckles, the thicker scars near the wrist, the slight pull in the skin when he bent 2 fingers on his left hand. Abigail looked at them before she could stop herself. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "This one was a trap line," he said, nodding once toward the worst scar near the wrist. "Spring snapped early." His voice carried no pride in it, no invitation to pity, just fact. She swallowed. "And the others?" He tied the knot in her bandage, then sat back slightly. Some were winter, some were men. Difference matters less than people think. That settled between them. Abigail let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. A strange thing loosened in her chest. Not comfort, not exactly, but the beginning of room. He hadn't offered a story polished for sympathy. He had given her the bones of it and trusted her not to ask for ornament. She understood that kind of trust. The pork finished crisping. Elias rose, set food between them, poured the coffee, and took his seat without remark. For a while they ate in silence, the kind that no longer felt like a test. Outside, wind moved around the cabin in long, low passes. Inside, firelight worked across the rough wood walls, catching now and then on the sharp planes of his face, on the scar at his jaw, on the broad stillness of him. Abigail tore bread with her newly wrapped hands and winced. Elias saw it, said nothing, and slid the coffee closer. That small adjustment landed with the same force as the bandage. Respect, she realized, did not always arrive in speeches. Sometimes it came like this. Quiet, practical, making room without making a show of it. She looked into the cup, then up at the fire. "He used to say iron had a temper because men did," she said, the words leaving before she could reconsider them. Said both would turn brittle if he heated them wrong. It was the first time she'd spoken of her husband since leaving town. The room did not shrink from it. Elias didn't either. "He wasn't wrong," he said. And for reasons she could not have explained, that was enough to make the grief in her throat change shape. Elias didn't ask her to continue. He didn't lean in, didn't fill the space with questions meant to pull something out of her before she was ready to let it go. He simply sat, eating slow, drinking when the cup cooled enough, leaving the silence open in a way that did not demand to be filled. That made it easier. Harder, too. Abigail turned the cup once between her hands, feeling the warmth shift through the metal, the heat uneven but steady enough to hold. They used to come to him with everything, she said after a while, her voice lower now, less guarded, as if the words had to pass through something thick before they reached the air. Tools, hinges, horseshoes, things they broke, things they wore down. He fixed it all. Didn't matter who it was. She paused, not searching for the next part, just letting the memory settle long enough to see it clearly before she spoke again. Didn't matter how they spoke to him either. Some of them didn't speak well. A faint, humorless edge touched the corner of her mouth, gone before it could settle. He said work didn't belong to pride. Said a man who needed something fixed didn't get to decide what kind of hands fixed it. Elias listened. Not still in the way of someone waiting to speak, but steady in the way of someone who understood the value of letting a thing finish in its own time. Abigail's gaze dropped back to her hands. The cloth had already begun to darken where the salve met the edges of torn skin. They never looked at him the way they look at me, she went on, quieter now. Not really. They saw what he could do. That was enough. The words thinned there. Not because she had run out of them, because the next ones cost more. When he died, it was like none of it had ever belonged to me, she said. Not the work, not the place, not even the memory of it. They didn't have to say it out loud. You can feel that kind of thing without hearing it. The fire shifted in the stove, a low crack that broke the moment just enough to keep it from closing in. They'd already decided, she added, almost to herself, long before I understood they had. Elias set his cup down, not sharply, just enough to mark that he had heard what mattered. They didn't decide anything, he said. They revealed it. Abigail looked up at that. The distinction landed slow, but it held. Revealed it. Not something new, something that had always been there. The room settled again, but the silence felt different now, less like something pressing in, more like something holding space. She studied him for a moment, the lines of his face in the shifting light, the stillness that never quite softened but no longer felt closed either. "What about you?" she asked, the question coming before she could weigh it properly. "You talk like a man who's seen enough of people to stop expecting much from them." Elias didn't answer right away. He leaned back slightly, not away from her, but into himself, as if the question had reached a place he didn't visit often and had no intention of rushing into now. "There was a cabin," he said at last, his voice even, stripped of anything unnecessary. "Not far from where I used to trap. Woman lived there with a boy. Winter hit harder than expected that year. Food ran short." He paused, not for effect, for accuracy. "I had enough," he continued. "Not plenty. Enough. I told myself I'd bring it by in the morning. Roads were bad. Night was worse." The fire cracked again, louder this time. Abigail didn't move, didn't interrupt. "By the time I got there," he said, "the door was open. Fire was out. Boy had wrapped himself around her to keep her warm." His gaze dropped, not to the floor, not to anything in particular, just away from the line of her eyes. It hadn't been enough. The words settled hard. No apology, no attempt to soften what they meant, just fact. Abigail felt something tighten in her chest, not the sharp edge of her own grief, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized the shape of what he had left unsaid. She didn't reach for it, didn't try to fix it. Some things didn't ask to be fixed. "They weren't yours to save," she said quietly. Elias shook his head once. "No," he agreed. "But I was close enough to think otherwise." That sat between them, heavier than anything else had so far. Close enough. Not responsible, but not free either. Abigail understood that kind of weight. Not the same story, not the same loss, but the same refusal to let a thing go just because it didn't belong to you by right. The fire burned lower. Elias rose without comment, fed it another piece of wood, adjusted the vent, then returned to his seat. The movement was familiar now, not distant, not closed, just part of the rhythm of the place. Abigail leaned back slightly, the ache in her body settling into something deeper, something that no longer fought her every breath. Her hands rested in her lap, wrapped, still, but not useless. Not anymore. They looked at me like I was the problem, she said after a while, her voice steadier now, less caught on the edges of itself. Like if I'd been different, stronger, smaller, something, maybe it would have held. Maybe the forge wouldn't have gone dark. Elias's eyes lifted to hers. That's not how work fails, he said. Simple. Final. She held his gaze. Then how does it fail? He didn't hesitate this time. It fails when the people who depend on it decide it doesn't belong to the one doing it. The answer cut cleaner than anything Halvar had said that morning, because it carried no insult, only truth. Abigail let that settle, felt it shift something in her, not healing, not yet, but loosening the grip of something that had been fixed too tight for too long. The room quieted again, but it no longer felt like the end of something. It felt like the space after a thing had been set down properly. Elias stood. Not abruptly, just done sitting. There's more wood to split in the morning, he said, as if that was the only conclusion that mattered. Fire won't hold itself. Abigail nodded. Not out of agreement, out of understanding. He moved toward the far side of the cabin, where a simple bed had been set against the wall. No excess, no decoration, just what was needed. She remained where she was for a moment longer, listening to the fire, to the quiet, to the absence of everything that had once pressed her into the shape of something smaller. Too big, too slow. The words came again, but they didn't land the same way. Not here. Not now. She rose, the ache in her body answering the movement, the work of the day written into every step, and crossed the room without hesitation. There was a second bed, rough but solid, waiting without comment. She sat, then lay back, the wood beneath her firm, unyielding, real in a way the past few days had not been. The fire burned low. The shadows settled, and for the first time since the world had decided what she was worth, Abigail closed her eyes, without bracing for what would be taken next. Morning didn't arrive all at once. It bled in, cold first, thin and patient, sliding under the door, through the seams in the walls, settling low across the floor before the light ever touched the room. The fire had burned down to a bed of dull coals, enough to hold shape, not enough to pretend at warmth. Abigail woke before the rest of her did, eyes opening into gray, her body slow to follow, the ache from the day before already waiting where she had left it. She lay still for a moment, listening. No voices, no footsteps outside, just the quiet of a place that didn't owe anyone noise. Then she sat up. The movement pulled tight along her shoulders, down her back, into her arms, the memory of the hammer written into muscle that hadn't known that kind of work for longer than she cared to count. Her hands throbbed beneath the bandage, a steady pulse, not sharp, not urgent, just present, real. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood. Elias was already up. Of course he was. He stood near the door, pulling on his coat, movements efficient, measured, the same way he did everything else. He didn't look at her when she rose, didn't comment on the stiffness in her posture or the way she tested her weight before committing to it. He simply opened the door, let the cold in fully, and stepped out into it. Work didn't wait. Neither did he. Abigail followed. The clearing looked different in morning light. What had been shadowed and uncertain the night before now lay exposed, the rough lines of the land visible in a way that offered no comfort. The cabin sat alone against it, no road leading in, no easy path leading out. Just ground, uneven and honest. Elias moved toward a stack of wood near the edge of the clearing, splitting axe already in hand. He didn't hand her one, didn't assign her a task. He just began. The first strike split clean, the sound sharp in the morning air, the wood giving way under force applied without hesitation. The second followed, then the third, each movement as controlled as the last, no wasted effort, no excess. Abigail stood for a moment watching. Then she moved. Not to him, to the pile. She selected a piece, heavier than it looked, set it upright, and reached for the spare axe leaning against the stump. The handle felt different from the hammer, longer, less forgiving, the balance unfamiliar but not impossible. She adjusted her grip, planted her feet, and lifted. The first swing was wrong, too much arm, not enough body. The blade glanced off, biting shallow, not enough to split, just enough to mark. She reset, lifted again. This time she felt it more clearly, the need to bring her weight into it, not just her arms, to let gravity and mass do part of the work instead of fighting it. The axe came down harder, cleaner, the wood cracking under it, not fully, but enough to begin. She struck again, and again. The rhythm came slower than with the hammer, but it came. Elias didn't stop, didn't watch, but he adjusted his pace just enough that the sound of his strikes didn't drown hers out. Not assistance, not instruction. Space. Time passed, measured in blows, measured in breath, measured in the steady burn building in her arms until the ache from yesterday found new life layered over it. Then, the sound changed. Not from the axe, from the distance. A low rumble, faint at first, then clearer, the rhythm uneven but growing, like something approaching without concern for being heard. Abigail paused mid-swing, the axe head resting against the marked wood as she turned her head toward the edge of the trees. Elias had already stopped. He stood still, the axe lowered but not set aside, his attention fixed on the same direction. The sound grew. Hooves. More than one. Not fast, not cautious either. Confident in the way only men who believed they were expected could be. Abigail felt it before she saw them. The shift in her chest, the tightening that had nothing to do with the cold. The clearing that had felt wide enough the night before now seemed smaller, the space between the cabin and the tree line narrowing without moving. They broke through a moment later. 3 riders. Coats clean enough to mark them as men who didn't work with their hands unless it served a purpose. The lead horse slowed as it entered the clearing, the rider sitting straight, controlled, his gaze moving once across the cabin, the woodpile, Elias, and then settling where it had always intended to, on her. Halver. He didn't dismount immediately. He didn't need to. He let the horse step forward once, then again, closing the distance with the same measured patience he had shown in the forge, as if the land itself would adjust to accommodate him if given enough time. "I was wondering how far you'd run," he said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing, smooth as before, unchanged, as if nothing from the day before had unsettled him at all. "Turns out, not very." The men behind him shifted in their saddles, not speaking, not laughing, but present in a way that didn't require either. Abigail didn't step back, didn't step forward. She stood where she was, the axe still in her hand, the weight of it no longer unfamiliar, but not yet something she trusted completely either. "You found what you needed to say yesterday," she replied, her voice steady enough to hold. "Don't reckon there's more to it today." Halver's smile returned, thin, measured. "There's always more," he said, "especially when a matter has not been resolved." His gaze moved past her then, briefly, landing on Elias without lingering, acknowledging without conceding. I gave you an opportunity, he continued, bringing his attention back to Abigail. A simple one. You declined. He tilted his head slightly, the gesture almost conversational. That changes the terms. The air tightened. The morning lost whatever quiet it had been holding. And this time, they hadn't come to talk her into leaving. They had come expecting to take what she refused to give. They had come expecting to take what she refused to give. The space between them held for a moment, thin and stretched, like something drawn tight enough to snap if pushed the wrong way. The horses shifted under their riders, breath steaming in the cold, hooves grinding lightly against the hard ground. Halvor let the silence work, let it settle over the clearing the same way it had settled over the forge, confident that, given enough time, it would do the work for him. Then he reached into his coat, slow, deliberate. The paper came out folded the same way it had the day before, edges clean, untouched by the dust of the road, as if it had never been put away at all. This is the last time I'll make this easy, he said, holding it between two fingers, not extending it yet, not offering it so much as displaying it. Sign it, and you walk away from this place without further complication. Refuse, and I proceed under authority that doesn't require your consent. The words landed heavier now. Not suggestion, not persuasion. Statement. Abigail's grip tightened on the axe, not lifting it, not threatening, just holding. I told you already, she said, her voice lower, steadier than before, the rough edges worn down by something that had started to settle inside her. It ain't yours to take. Halvor's smile thinned further. It is precisely mine to take, he replied, the patience in his tone wearing thinner now, the calm showing its edge. Debt does not vanish because you lack the strength to carry it. It transfers. It settles. It claims what stands in its place when the man who owed it is no longer present to answer. He let that sit, then added, softer, more pointed, and you are not the man who built this. The words struck. Not loud, not sharp, but clean. Abigail felt them land, felt the old instinct to fold inward, to let the weight of them settle until there was no space left to resist. For a moment, it almost worked. The clearing seemed to narrow, the distance between her and the riders shrinking without movement, the axe in her hand feeling heavier, less certain. Then, the memory of the hammer, the rhythm, the strike that had held. She shifted her stance. Not back, forward, just enough. You're right, she said. The admission caught even her by surprise. Halvor's brow lifted a fraction, interest flickering where certainty had been. I ain't him, she continued, her voice finding its place, not raised, not pushed, just steady. But I was there. Every day he worked that forge, I was there. Every piece that came through, I held it, turned it, watched it take shape. She lifted the axe slightly, not in threat, but in acknowledgement of its weight. I know what it takes. The men behind Halvor shifted again. Not much, but enough. Halvor noticed. Of course he did. His gaze hardened, the patience thinning to something sharper. Knowing is not doing, he said, echoing his own words from the day before, but without the same ease. And doing is not enough when the claim has already been made. He folded the paper once. Clean. Final. You mistake effort for ownership, he went on. This land, that forge, the work tied to it, none of it belongs to you by right. It belonged to a man who understood what it meant to hold it. When he failed, he didn't fail. The words cut through his. Not loud, not forced, but they landed. Abigail hadn't planned them. They came anyway. Halvor stilled, just for a moment, long enough to register the interruption. Then his expression reset, colder now, the last trace of civility slipping. He is dead, Halvor said. each word placed with care. And dead men do not keep hold of what they leave behind. Abigail's jaw tightened. He didn't fail, she repeated, quieter this time, but no less certain. And I ain't leaving. The clearing held that. No one laughed. No one moved. Halvor exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, as if he had reached the end of patience he had decided to extend. "So be it," he said. He nodded once. The men behind him dismounted, not rushed, not hesitant. They moved with the confidence of men who believed the outcome had already been decided for them. One step toward the woodpile, another toward the cabin, their attention not on Elias, not yet, but on the space itself, as if it were already theirs to walk through. Abigail's grip tightened. The axe rose a fraction higher. Not enough to strike, enough to matter. "Stop," she said. The word carried, not far, but far enough. The man nearest the cabin paused, glancing back toward Halvor for instruction rather than challenge. Halvor didn't look at him. His eyes remained on Abigail. "Do you intend to use that?" he asked, his tone almost curious now, though the edge beneath it had sharpened into something dangerous. "Against men who are here under lawful claim?" The word lawful hung in the air, like something that expected to be obeyed. Abigail didn't answer. Not with words. She shifted again, planting her feet the same way she had at the anvil, the same way she had learned the day before, grounding herself before any movement could betray her. The axe steadied in her hands. Elias still hadn't moved. He stood where he had been, silent, watching, the same way he had watched her at the forge, not intervening, not stepping forward to claim the moment for himself. But something had changed. The space around him had tightened. Not visible, felt. Like the air itself had drawn in, waiting. Halvor noticed that too. His gaze flicked once toward Elias, brief, measuring, then returned to Abigail, as if deciding that whatever stood behind her mattered less than what stood in front. "Last chance," he said, the words stripped of patience now. "Set that down, walk away, or you will learn very quickly what it costs to stand where you have no right to stand." Abigail's hands held. Didn't shake, didn't drop. The ache in her arms burned. The memory of the hammer rose, the rhythm, the strike, the truth that had begun to take shape in her body before her mind had caught up. The weight was not the problem. The weight was the power. She took one step forward, small, enough. "I reckon," she said, her voice steady, grounded in something that hadn't been there before. "We're about to find out who's right." The clearing went still. Not empty, not quiet. Waiting. And this time, she didn't feel like the thing being measured. She felt like the thing that would decide what came next. What came first wasn't the snow. It was the wind. A hard, low sound pushing through the trees, distant at first, then rising fast, like something vast had turned its head toward the clearing and decided to come through it rather than around. The horses felt it before the men did. Ears pulled back, hooves shifted, breath sharpened in their nostrils as the air changed from cold to cutting. Halvor noticed. So did Elias. The tree line moved in a single dark shudder, branches bowing under a force that hadn't been there a breath before. Dry leaves tore loose and spun across the clearing in a sudden violent sweep, scraping over the ground, striking the cabin wall, circling the men's boots like a warning too old to need words. No one spoke. Then the temperature dropped. Not slowly, all at once. Abigail felt it cut through her coat and settle into the sweat still trapped under her clothes from the morning's labor. The cold hit deeper because of that, sharp enough to make her muscles tighten. The axe in her hands went colder too, the wood of the handle turning slick where her palm had warmed it moments before. Above them, the sky had changed. What little morning light had held the clearing together was gone now, swallowed behind a wall of gray rolling in low and fast, thick as smoke, but heavier, denser, alive with motion. It had the look of weather that didn't pass through politely, weather that took inventory. Halvor glanced upward, then toward the trees, calculating, weighing distance against pride. One of the men near the cabin muttered, "Storm's moving fast." Elias spoke before Halvor could answer. "Get off the horses." The command came flat, immediate, not shouted. The kind of voice that expected the world to obey because it had no spare use for repetition. Halvor turned toward him, irritation already rising. "We are not taking instruction from—" The first blast of wind hit before he finished. It slammed through the clearing hard enough to shove the nearest horse sideways, the animal rearing half up in panic, front legs cutting the air as the rider swore and fought for the reins. Snow came with it then, not in soft flakes, not drifting, but driven sharp and sideways, fine as ground salt, dense enough to blur the trees within seconds. The clearing vanished by degrees, edges first, then depth, then shape. Abigail threw up an arm against her face on instinct, the sting of ice sharp against her skin. The axe nearly slipped when the horse to her left lunged, wrenching its reins free from the rider's grip. The man shouted, stumbled, and the animal bolted past the woodpile, wild-eyed, vanishing into the gray almost immediately. "Inside," Elias said. This time no one argued. He was already moving, crossing the clearing fast, not toward Abigail first, but toward the second rider whose mount had begun to buck under the pressure of the wind. Elias caught the bridle mid-lunge, boots digging into the ground, shoulders locking hard against the force of the animal. For one breath, the horse fought him, head tossing, muscles jerking against the bit. Then the world cracked. A branch tore free from the top of one of the pines at the edge of the clearing, ripped loose by the wind and sent spinning down through the storm. Abigail saw it too late to shout in time. It came down hard, striking the rider across the back and shoulder, throwing him sideways out of the saddle and into the snow-packed dirt, with a sound that disappeared beneath the wind. The horse screamed. Elias let go of the bridle and turned, but the branch had not finished falling. The heavier end slammed into him as it dropped, driving across his side and shoulder, carrying him down to one knee before rolling hard against the ground. Abigail felt the impact in her own ribs. For a moment the scene broke apart into pieces, the horse twisting free, one man crawling, Halvor shouting something she couldn't hear, snow hitting so hard it looked less like weather and more like the world being scraped away. Elias tried to rise. Didn't make it. The branch had caught him wrong, pinning the lower half of his coat and one arm beneath its weight. He shoved once against it with his free hand, jaw set, movement strong but shortened. Pain flashed across his face then, fast and sharp, there and gone in a single breath. That frightened her more than the storm, because nothing in him had suggested break before now. Another gust hit, stronger than the first, driving snow clear through the open sides of the woodstack and against the cabin wall in a hard white sheet. Visibility dropped again. Halvor's remaining horse tore loose and vanished into the storm after the first. One of his men was shouting from somewhere near the trees, but the sound came thin, directionless, already half lost. Abigail moved, not after thinking, before it. She dropped the axe and lunged toward Elias, boots slipping in the fast-thickening snow, cold biting at her lungs with every breath. By the time she reached him, the branch looked even larger up close, twisted, heavy, one end still braced against a rock where it had landed. Elias looked up at her once. Snow had already caught in his hair and across the shoulders of his coat. His face had gone tighter around the eyes, the control in him still there, but forced now through pain instead of strength. "Leave it," he said. She ignored him, set both hands against the branch, pushed. Nothing. The bark tore rough against her bandaged palms. Her boots slid, finding no purchase in the churned mix of dirt, snow, and broken needles beneath her. The thing barely shifted. Too heavy. The thought came hard, familiar, cruel. For half a breath it threatened to stop her. Then she heard Halvor's voice, somewhere to her right, ragged now, stripped of polish by wind and fear. "Get to the cabin! Move!" Not to help Elias, not to help the fallen man, to save himself. Something in Abigail went still, not empty, clear. She widened her stance, bent lower, and set herself again, not using just her arms this time, not fighting the weight from the wrong place. She dug down through her legs, through her hips, through the same grounded center the forge had taught her to find under pressure. Then she lifted. Not with her arms, not first. She drove through her legs, through the ground, through the same stubborn center that had learned the rhythm of the hammer only a day before. The branch didn't rise clean. It resisted, bit back, dragged against her grip as if the storm itself had hold of it. But it moved. An inch, then another. Her shoulders screamed, the strain tearing through muscle, not meant for this kind of weight without warning. But she didn't let go. Her teeth set, breath breaking against the cold, each inhale cutting sharp through her chest. "Again," Elias said, not loud, but there. She shifted her footing, found the angle, and heaved once more, forcing the branch just high enough for him to wrench his trapped arm free. The moment he did, the weight dropped back down, slamming into the ground with a dull, final thud that shook through her boots. Elias rolled clear, pushing himself up with one arm, not steady, but moving. That was enough. "Inside," he said again, shorter this time, stripped down to necessity. Abigail didn't wait. She grabbed his coat, not gently, not asking, and pulled, bracing her weight against his as he rose. He didn't resist. Didn't lean fully either. He matched her movement just enough to keep forward momentum. One step, then another. Both of them fighting the wind that now tore through the clearing in hard, relentless bursts. Snow drove sideways, thick and blinding, stinging against exposed skin, filling the air until distance collapsed to nothing. The cabin door was barely visible through it, a dark shape where there should have been none. Behind them, one of Halvor's men shouted again, closer this time, voice raw, lost. The other was on his feet now, staggering, trying to reach the shelter with one arm hanging wrong at his side. Halvor himself was moving too. Not toward them, toward the cabin, alone. Abigail saw it in a flash between gusts, the way he angled his body, the way he chose his line, not checking for the others, not calling back. The same man who had stood so certain in the forge now fought the storm with nothing but instinct and self-preservation. She felt the choice then. Clear. Cold. The cabin was steps away. Elias was hurt. The wind was rising. She could let the others fend for themselves. No one would question it. No one would call it wrong. Her grip tightened on Elias's coat. Then she let go. "Get inside," she said, her voice cutting through the wind just enough to reach him. He didn't argue. Didn't waste breath on it. He moved toward the door, slower now, controlled, each step measured against pain. Abigail turned back into the storm. The world beyond a few paces was gone, swallowed by white and motion. She followed the sound, not the shape, the broken shout of the injured man near the edge of the clearing. It took longer than it should have. The ground shifted underfoot, hidden obstacles catching her boots, pulling her offline. Once she went down to one knee, snow packing hard against her leg before she forced herself back up. The man appeared out of the gray suddenly, half crawling, half dragging himself forward, his face white under the sting of snow, his breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. "Can't," he started. She didn't let him finish. She caught him under the good arm and hauled him up, the weight awkward, unbalanced, nothing like the clean resistance of steel or wood. He sagged into her, dead weight in places that mattered, alive in the wrong ones, fighting her without meaning to. "Move," she said. Not unkind, not gentle. Final. They staggered together, step by step, toward where the cabin should be. The wind shifted again, harder, driving them sideways, forcing her to plant and push, the man slipping against her grip. Too heavy, too slow. The words tried to rise again. She crushed them, used them, set her feet the way she had at the anvil, found the ground beneath the chaos, and drove forward with everything she had left. The cabin loomed out of the storm at the last moment, dark and solid, Elias already at the door, one hand braced against the frame. He stepped forward the moment he saw them, taking the injured man's weight without question, pulling him inside while Abigail followed, slamming the door shut behind them with both hands. The wind hit it hard. Once. Twice. Then became a constant force against the wood, rattling it in the frame, testing it. Inside, the air felt thin but real, contained, alive. The injured man collapsed to the floor, breath ragged, clutching his shoulder. The other stumbled in moments later, half blind, face cut raw by the storm. Halver came last, forcing the door closed behind him, his composure gone, replaced by something tighter, more fragile. No one spoke at first. The storm did enough of that for all of them. Elias moved to the man on the floor, checking the shoulder with quick, efficient hands. The man winced, gasping as Elias set the joint with a sharp, practiced motion that drew a strangled cry from his throat. "Hold him," Elias said. Abigail was already there. Her hands steadied the man without hesitation, grip firm, unyielding. The same hands that had lifted steel now holding flesh together under pain. "Stay with it," she said. The words came out before she thought about them. Elias glanced at her once, just once, but it held. The storm roared outside, shaking the walls, testing every seam, every joint, every piece of wood that held the place together. Snow packed against the door, against the windows, sealing them in as completely as any lock. Halver stood near the wall, breathing hard, his eyes moving over the room, over Elias, over Abigail, over the men he had brought, seeing something different now, something he had not accounted for. Abigail felt it too, the shift. Not in the storm, in herself. She wasn't the one being pushed anymore, wasn't the one being measured. She had stepped into the weight, held it, moved through it. And now, when the world pressed back, she didn't fold. She stood. The fire needed feeding. The injured needed tending. The cabin needed holding against what waited outside. Abigail moved toward the stove without being told, adding wood, adjusting the draft, bringing the heat back up with the same care she had learned at the forge. Behind her, Elias worked. Across from her, Halver watched. And for the first time since he had come to take something from her, he was no longer certain what exactly he was dealing with. The storm did not ease. It settled. Not weaker, not passing, but constant, a steady force pressing against the cabin from all sides, as if it had decided this place was worth testing until it broke. Wind struck the walls in long, hard bursts, snow driving into every seam, every weakness, every place that had been left unguarded for too long. Inside, the air thickened with heat and breath, alive, barely. The fire Abigail had fed caught slow, then stronger, the flames pulling up through the wood with a low, steady hunger that answered the cold pressing in from beyond the walls. She adjusted the draft again, not guessing now, not hesitating, her hands moving with the same quiet certainty she had begun to find at the forge. Behind her, the injured man groaned. Elias worked without pause, resetting the shoulder clean, binding it tight, his movements efficient even with the strain showing in the way he held his own side. He said little, needed little said. The other man hovered close, uncertain, looking between Elias and the storm, waiting for direction he had never needed to think about before. Halvor stayed near the wall, not idle, watching. His breathing had steadied, his posture drawn back together piece by piece, the fracture in his composure sealing itself behind something colder, more controlled. He was not a man who let fear sit long. He reshaped it, turned it into calculation. His gaze settled on Abigail, stayed there. "You seem to have found your footing," he said at last, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier polish, but no less sharp for it. "Strange place to discover it." Abigail didn't turn immediately. She finished with the fire first, closed the vent a fraction, watched the flames settle into something sustainable before she straightened and faced him. "This place holds," she said. Simple. Not offered as argument, as fact. Halvor's eyes moved once around the cabin, taking in the walls, the stove, the men now sitting instead of standing, the storm pressing against all of it. "For now," he replied. "Storms pass. Claims do not." The words carried the same weight they had outside, but they didn't land the same way. Abigail stepped away from the stove, not toward him, into the center of the room, grounded, balanced. The space shifted with her, subtle, but real. "You keep talking like paper decides what stands and what falls," she said, her voice steady, even, not raised to meet his. "Out there, maybe it does. In here, it don't mean much if the walls come down." Halvor's expression tightened, just enough to show the line he walked between patience and control. "Everything means something," he said. "You mistake the moment for the whole. This storm will end. When it does, we return to the matter at hand." Elias didn't look up, but he listened. Abigail saw it in the way his hands stilled for half a breath on the bandage he had just tied. "Maybe," she said, "but right now, you ain't returning to anything." Halvor's gaze sharpened. "And you believe you can stop that?" "I already have." The words landed before he could counter them. Not loud, not forced, but final in a way that didn't ask for agreement. The man with the newly set shoulders shifted, looking between them, then down at his hands, as if trying to understand when the balance had changed and how he had missed it. Halvor took a step forward, slow, measured, the same way he had approached her at the forge. But this time, the space did not yield. Abigail did not lower her gaze, did not shift her stance. She held. The distance between them closed by a single step, then stopped. Not because Halvor chose it, because something in the room made it clear another step would not land the same way as the last. Elias rose, not fast, not with force, but with weight. The movement alone altered the air, pulling it tight, drawing every eye without demand. He didn't come to stand in front of Abigail, didn't step between them. He simply moved to her side, close enough that his presence anchored the space without claiming it for himself. Halvor noticed. He adjusted, just slightly, enough to show that calculation had replaced certainty. "You misunderstand me," Halvor said, his voice smoothing again, rebuilding its earlier shape piece by piece. "This is not a contest of will. It is a matter of order, of law, of what stands when emotion has burned itself out." Abigail shook her head once, slow. "No," she said. "It's a matter of what holds when everything else don't." The storm answered that, slamming hard against the wall behind Halver, the wood shuddering under the force, a low crack running through the frame before settling again. The cabin held. For now. But not without cost. Elias moved then, not toward Halver but toward the wall, his hand pressing against the wood where it had flexed. He tested it once, then looked to Abigail. "Supports," he said. One word. Enough. She moved immediately, crossing to the far side, grabbing the nearest beam stacked near the door, dragging it into place with both hands. The weight bit into her shoulders, into her arms, the strain flaring again where the day's work had already worn her thin. She set it against the wall, braced it, adjusted. Elias did the same on his side, working faster than he should have given the way he held his ribs, but not stopping, not yielding to it. The other men hesitated, then followed, not because Halver told them to, because the work was there, because the storm did not care who owned what. For a moment, Halver stood alone in the center, watching as the space he had come to claim reorganized itself without him. That was when it changed. Not outside, inside. Abigail straightened from the beam, breath heavy, hands burning, and turned back toward him. "You want this place?" she said. Not loud, clear. "Then you help hold it." The words hung there. Not a request, not a bargain. A line. A line. Not drawn in anger, not forced. Placed. Halver looked at her. Truly looked this time, not past her, not through her, not measuring what could be taken, but taking in what stood there now and finding that it did not match what he had already decided. The storm pressed harder against the walls. The cabin answered with a low, strained creak, the wood shifting under force that did not intend to ease. Snow packed into the seams, wind driving it deeper, testing every joint, every place where something had been built by hand instead of decree. Halver's gaze flicked once to the wall Elias had braced, then to the beam Abigail held steady with both hands, then to the men he had brought, no longer waiting for his instruction, no longer looking to him for direction. They were working. Because they had to. Because the storm did not care who owned them, or what paper said. He stood there one breath longer, caught between what he had been and what the moment demanded. Then he moved. Not forward, not back. To the beam near the door. He set his shoulder to it, testing the weight, adjusting the angle with a careful, practiced hand that spoke of a man who had not always lived behind papers and claims. For a moment, the old shape of him showed through. Someone who understood structure, pressure, the difference between something that would hold and something that would fail. Abigail saw it, said nothing, did not thank him, did not soften the space to make the choice easier than it was. He had crossed the line. That was enough. The work took them, no longer separate, no longer measured, just bodies against force. Abigail moved between positions without waiting to be told, checking each brace, shifting weight where it needed to be shifted, learning the cabin the same way she had learned the forge, through pressure, through response, through the language of things that either held or didn't. A crack sounded from the far wall, sharp, new. She turned before the sound finished, crossing the room in 2 strides, dropping her shoulder into the beam Elias had set, pushing it tighter into place. The wood bit back, resisting, then settled under the force. "Lower," she said. Elias adjusted without question. The beam dropped 1/2 inch. Locked. The crack didn't spread. Behind them, one of the men slipped, his footing lost on the packed snow that had begun to creep across the floor near the door. He hit hard, breath leaving him in a rush, the beam he had been holding shifting dangerously out of line. Abigail moved. Fast. Not thinking. She caught the beam before it could fall, the weight slamming into her arms, driving her down a fraction before she held, muscles screaming as the pressure forced its way through her. "Up," she said. The man scrambled, grabbed hold, lifted where she directed, not arguing, not questioning, just following the force of her voice as if it had always been there. Together, they set it right. Elias glanced at her, just once. But this time there was no distance in it, no testing, only recognition. The storm roared, the cabin held. Minutes stretched, or hours. Time lost its edges, reduced to effort, to breath, to the constant push against something that did not tire, did not hesitate, did not care if they broke. Abigail's arms burned past pain now into something duller, deeper, the muscles moving because they had to, not because they had anything left to give. Her back ached, her hands throbbed under the bandage, her breath came hard and steady, each inhale sharp with cold air that slipped through despite their work. Still, she held. Still, she moved. Still, she decided where the weight went. Halvor worked in silence, not directing, not claiming, holding, adjusting, learning. At one point his hand slipped on the beam, the skin of his palm tearing where it met rough wood. He hissed under his breath, the sound brief, contained. Abigail saw it, saw the way he almost pulled back, almost chose distance over strain. "Stay with it," she said. The words came without pause, the same words Elias had given her. They landed. Halvor's hand tightened. He held. Something passed between them then. Not forgiveness, not understanding. Something simpler. Recognition of weight. The storm began to shift, not weakening, changing. The wind turned, striking from a different angle, the pressure redistributing across the cabin in a way that forced them to move again, to reset, to adapt before the structure could fail under a new kind of strain. Abigail felt it first, noticed the change in sound, in the way the walls answered, in the subtle give under her hands that hadn't been there before. "Back wall," she said. No hesitation. Elias moved. So did the others, even Halvor. They crossed the space together, resetting the braces, shifting the support, meeting the new pressure before it could settle into a weakness. The cabin groaned, then steadied. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside, the structure held. Not because it had been built perfectly, not because it had been claimed by law, but because every hand inside it had chosen to hold it up. Abigail stepped back at last, just a fraction, enough to see the room as a whole. The fire still burned, the walls still stood. The men who had come to take were now part of what was being protected. Elias stood beside her, not behind, not over, beside. Halvor leaned against the beam he had been holding, breath heavier now, his coat dusted white, his hands no longer clean. He looked at her again. Different. The certainty he had worn like armor in the forge was gone, replaced by something less stable, more honest. "You think this changes anything?" he said, but the question lacked the edge it had carried before. Abigail met his gaze, did not look away. "It already has." The words didn't rise, didn't push. They settled, like truth. Halvor held her eyes for a moment longer, then looked away. Not in defeat, in acknowledgement. Outside, the storm pressed on. Inside, the ground had shifted. And for the first time since the world had tried to name her, Abigail stood at the center of it, not as something to be carried, but as the one who carried everything that mattered. The storm passed in the night, but it left its mark behind. Not just on the clearing, where snow stood banked high against the cabin walls, and broken branches lay half buried like bones too stubborn to disappear. Not just on Elias, whose ribs bound tight beneath his shirt made every breath shallower than he let on. Not just on Halvor, whose hands were no longer clean, whose silence on the ride back to town had hardened into something brittle and inward. It left its mark on Abigail most of all. By the time they returned, the snow along the road had already begun to gray under wagon wheels and boot traffic, churned into slush at the center of town where people gathered for trade, gossip, and the old habit of watching someone else's life go crooked. The market square looked the same from a distance. Same warped porch posts, same feed sacks piled beneath canvas, same men leaning in clusters with their hands hooked in belts, as if the earth itself might slip without their supervision. But nothing in it settled the same way. Word had outrun them. Of course it had. News in a town like that never traveled by speed. It traveled by appetite. By the time Abigail stepped into the square, heads had already turned. Conversations thinned, then broke. Faces shifted from curiosity to recognition, then to something tighter, less comfortable, as if the sight of her there required them to reconsider things they had preferred to keep settled. She wore no fine coat, no borrowed dignity, no decoration meant to soften what she was. Her dress was plain, her boots worn, her hands wrapped where the hammer and the beam had bitten through skin. The work was still on her, in the set of her shoulders, in the grounded way she walked, in the fact that she no longer seemed to shrink from the space she occupied. Elias came beside her, not leading, not shielding, just there, broad and quiet as ever, his presence carrying its own kind of warning. He did not need to look at anyone for the crowd to make room. They remembered him. More than that, they remembered the way the storm had sent Halvor back into town looking like a man who had seen the limits of paper in a place where wood, wind, and labor made the final argument. Halvor himself had arrived earlier. That much was clear from the way he stood near the steps of the mercantile, coat brushed, posture rebuilt, one hand gloved now to hide what rough wood had done to the palm beneath. He had restored his face, his bearing, the old arrangement of calm authority he trusted more than any honest feeling. But the square had changed around him. Even those who still leaned toward his side did so with more care, as if certainty had become expensive. A table had been set out, papers laid atop it. The town clerk stood nearby, lips pressed thin, shoulders stiff with the discomfort of a man who preferred procedure only when it did not require courage. So that was the shape of it. Not a courtroom, something meaner than that. Judgment without walls. Halvor inclined his head as Abigail approached, the gesture polished enough to pass for courtesy if a body had not learned what sat underneath it. "Mrs. Abigail," he said, voice carrying just far enough for the square to hear, "I'm relieved to see you've decided to attend. There was concern you might mistake delay for victory." A few uneasy chuckles slipped loose, then died quickly when no one seemed willing to own them. Abigail stopped at the edge of the table and looked at the papers before she looked at him. She let the pause sit. Let the crowd lean into it. Let them feel, if only for a breath, what waiting on her answer felt like. "I didn't mistake anything," she said at last. "I came to hear what kind of theft men call lawful when enough people are watching." The words landed clean. No stumble, no tremor. A shift moved through the square, subtle but real. Men who had expected pleading heard steel instead. Women near the back, aprons still dusted with flour, stopped pretending they were only there to pass by. Even the clerk looked up properly now. Halvor's expression held, but the line around his mouth sharpened. "Careful," he said. "Public defiance does not strengthen a weak claim." Abigail lifted her gaze to his. "Neither does hiding greed behind paper." That one cut deeper, because it did not sound like anger. It sounded like fact. Halvor placed his gloved hand over the top sheet. "Your late husband died with debt outstanding. The forge, the adjoining property, and all associated holdings stand as collateral under contract. You were offered terms. You refused them. Today the town bears witness as the property is lawfully transferred." He said it well. That was part of what made men like him dangerous. He spoke in full sentences and polished order, arranged everything so neatly that a lie, once dressed, looked almost respectable. The clerk cleared his throat and reached for the paper. Abigail's hand came down first, flat against the table, not slamming, claiming. The sound stopped him. Halvor's eyes flicked to her hand, then back to her face. "Remove it," he said quietly. "No." The square held its breath. Halvor straightened, drawing himself back into the performance. "You seem determined to make a spectacle of your own misunderstanding." Abigail did not move her hand. "No," she said again, steadier this time, letting the words settle into the wood between them. "I'm determined to make sure the whole town hears exactly what kind of man asks a widow to surrender a forge he never built, a roof he never held against a storm, and work he's never done with his own hands." The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was listening. And for the first time in that town, Halvor looked like a man who understood that the crowd before him might not remain arranged in his favor simply because he had always expected it to. Halvor understood that the crowd was shifting. But men like him were never most dangerous when they held power easily. They were most dangerous when they felt it slipping and mistook stubbornness for command. He drew in a slow breath, laid his gloved hand flat beside hers on the papers, and let his gaze travel over the square before returning to Abigail with a composure so practiced it almost hid the strain beneath it. "You speak well for someone standing on sentiment instead of law," he said. "But grief does not alter contract, and labor does not erase debt. The town knows the difference." He meant that as a reminder, a way to pull them back into old habits, old obedience. For a moment, no one spoke. Not because they agreed, but because this was the part where they usually did what they had always done, let the man with paper turn decision into inevitability. Abigail felt it, the pull of the old shape, the temptation to answer too fast, too hot, too wounded, and let him name that emotion weakness, the way men like him always did. So she didn't. She let her hand remain on the papers, let the wind move once through the square, cold and thin, carrying with it the smells of damp wood, horse sweat, flour dust, and old iron from places men still worked because somebody had to. She looked, not at Halvor first, but at the people gathered around him. The blacksmith's hinges on a shop door behind them, the wagon wheel rim held by hammered bands, the plowshare leaning near the feed store. Things her husband had shaped, things she had watched being heated, turned, steadied, carried. Then she spoke. "You want law," she said, her voice low at first, forcing the square to quiet further if it wanted to hear her. "Fine. Let's speak plain enough for law to quit hiding behind good coats." She lifted her hand from the paper and turned, not away from Halvor, but outward, opening the words to the whole town. "My husband worked that forge until his hands cracked open in winter and bled into the handle. He worked when your wagon axle split. He worked when your gate hinges sagged. He worked when your fields needed new teeth for the plow and your horses needed shoes before first thaw." Her eyes moved from face to face, not accusing wildly, but landing where memory lived. "Some of you paid on time. Some of you paid late. Some of you asked for one more week, then another. He still worked." No one laughed now. No one shifted with comfort. Abigail kept going. "And I was there, every day. I hauled coal. I held iron. I turned metal with tongs until the heat pushed through leather and cloth and bit my hands all the same. I kept that place standing in all the ways this town never bothered to count, because counting a woman's labor would have forced you to admit the place did not run on one pair of hands alone. That one moved through them. A murmur, not loud but uneasy, because truth has a way of sounding familiar, even to people who've spent years avoiding it. Halvor stepped in quickly, trying to reclaim the pace. No one disputes you were present. Abigail turned her head and cut him off with a look that landed harder than interruption. Present? She said, the words stripped bare. That what you call carrying half the work so a man can keep swinging? Present? She shook her head once, slow, controlled. That's the kind of word a man uses when he needs labor small enough to dismiss. A few faces in the square dropped at that. Wives, daughters, men who knew exactly who kept their houses from collapsing while they called it simple help. Halvor's jaw tightened. This is not a debate over custom. It is a debt. No, Abigail said. It's a debt you counted one way, because that was the way most likely to leave me with nothing. The clerk swallowed audibly. Halvor's gloved fingers pressed against the edge of the table. Be careful what you accuse in public. Be careful what you try to take in public, she answered. The words hit like a hammer finding center. The square went still. Then Abigail stepped closer to the table, not leaning over it, not posturing, simply standing in full where no one could look away from what she was now. Her wrapped hands came to rest at her sides. Her voice did not rise, but it deepened, steadied, found the exact register of something earned under pressure. You all called me a burden, she said, and this time she looked at the crowd, not Halvor. Long before he died. Long before the forge went cold. You called me too big, too slow, too much. You looked at my body and decided that was the whole measure of me. Her gaze moved across the men near the trough, the women on the boardwalk, the boys pretending not to stare. And when my husband died, you did what cowards do best. You turned your old contempt into certainty. You told yourselves a woman you had never truly seen could not possibly hold what she had helped build. Her breath came once, deep, steady, and when she spoke again, the words landed with greater force because they were no longer only about her. But listen close, she said. A forge does not care how pretty a hand looks holding the hammer. A wall does not care whose name is on paper when the storm hits. A man pinned under timber does not ask whether the one lifting it fits neatly into your idea of strength. Her eyes shifted then, finding Halvor at last and holding him there. And you know that better than most. That hit him in the only place it could, not because it named the storm, because it named what the storm had exposed. A change ran through the square, not dramatic, no gasp worthy of theater, something subtler, heavier, the collective understanding that whatever had happened beyond town had not gone the way Halvor had intended, and that Abigail was speaking from a ground he could not easily deny without making a liar of himself in front of witnesses. Halvor opened his mouth, closed it, then tried another path. Even if I accepted this sentimental version of events, it alters nothing. Debt remains debt. Abigail nodded once. Then reckon it proper, she said. Reckon every unpaid hour I gave that forge. Reckon every order finished because I stood in that heap beside him. Reckon every roof in this town kept useful by work you never saw fit to name because it came from hands you found easy to mock. Her voice sharpened then, not into shouting, but into clarity so clean it cut. And if we are truly counting honest, reckon the storm, too. Reckon whose shoulder held the beam while your men shook. Reckon whose hands kept your people breathing when the cold came through like judgment. Reckon whose back stood between your lawful claim and a wall that would have folded you into the snow without so much as asking your name. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Abigail stepped one pace closer still, and though she was not a small woman, the power in her now did not come from size. It came from the absolute absence of apology. "My body may be heavy," she said, each word placed like iron under a hammer. "But my soul has carried more than this town ever had the courage to look at. You sneered and called me weight like weight was shame. But weight is what holds when the wind starts tearing. Weight is what keeps the roof up. Weight is what lets a person lift what lighter hearts drop." The square belonged to her now, completely. She turned once more to the people gathered there, and in that turn something shifted from defense to judgment. "You want to know what kind of men we are?" she asked. "Then don't look at the paper. Look at what we do when somebody breaks. Look at who steps closer, and who begins measuring the scrap before the body has gone cold. Look at who built with their hands, and who waits until grief opens the door so they can walk in calling theft order." A woman near the back murmured, "Lord, have mercy." Not loudly, but enough. Halver heard it. So did everyone else. Abigail placed her hand back on the papers, slower this time, flatter, final. "You said I couldn't carry this forge," she said, her eyes never leaving Halver's. "You were wrong. I carried the work. I carried the storm. I carried men who came here meaning to strip me bare, and I'm still standing." Her voice lowered, and somehow that made it strike harder. "So hear me plain. This place is not leaving my hands. Not for your paper, not for your pride, not for any town small enough to mistake cruelty for order." The silence afterward was complete, not empty, ruined for Halver. The clerk looked at him, waiting, but waiting differently now, as if procedure had suddenly discovered it was answerable to conscience after all. One of the men near the feed sacks muttered something about fair accounting. Another, louder, said, "She worked that forge same as him." A woman from the mercantile porch added, "More than some men I know." That was all it took. A crowd that had once made room for Halver's certainty now began, inch by inch, to step away from it. Halver stood very still, his face held, mostly. But certainty had left him. In its place sat something colder and far less useful, humiliation forced to remain upright in public. Abigail removed her hand from the papers. She did not need them pinned anymore. The whole town had already seen which claim held weight. Years did not fix everything. They rarely do. What they did, when given honest ground and enough labor, was turn pain into structure. Not softer, not prettier, just stronger in the places that mattered. 7 winters passed before the town stopped speaking of that day in the square as if it had happened yesterday. 10 before the story lost the sharp edges of scandal and settled into something closer to legend, the kind people told with lowered voices near stove heat when the wind was bad and work had finally gone still. But long before the telling changed, the forge itself had already answered the only question that ever mattered. It lived. Not as a relic, not as a pity spared to a widow because public shame had forced a few men to step back. It lived because Abigail made it live. The building expanded first, not all at once, but board by board, beam by beam. Each addition earned the same way the first room had been held, through labor, timing, and the refusal to let pressure decide the shape of a thing before the work was finished. The old forge remained at its heart, black stone and iron still carrying the memory of the first life it had held. But the roofline grew wider, the work floor longer, the storage lean-to deeper. A second hearth was built for lighter metalwork, a proper rack for tongs and swages. New bellows, hand-stitched and reinforced. a rain barrel system that kept the quench troughs filled even through mean summers. People came from farther out now, not just from town, from ranches 2 valleys over, from freight routes that cut near the ridge, from settlements whose names had once meant nothing to Abigail because nothing beyond survival had left room for curiosity. Wagons brought broken axle hoops, bent braces, snapped hinges, shattered plow points, harness buckles, stove latches, branding irons, and sometimes things strangers could not name, but hoped she might understand once fire laid the truth of them bare. Most times she did. She stood broader now than she had in those first days at the cabin. Not softer, not diminished, but settled into her own strength the way an oak settles into weather. Scarred where it must be, rooted where it counts. Work had changed her body without erasing it. Her arms carried more definition than before. Her back had grown surer. Her hands, though marked by old splits and new callus, moved with an economy she had once thought belonged only to people born into certainty. It had never belonged to certainty. It belonged to repetition, to endurance, to staying with the heat long enough for it to become useful. The town changed too, though not out of sudden virtue. Towns rarely repent cleanly. They adjust when reality grows too solid to deny. Men who had once lowered their voices when she passed now lifted a hand in greeting because they needed work done and had finally learned that need can sand pride down where sermons fail. Women who had watched from porch rails came openly now, bringing orders, bringing payment, sometimes bringing daughters, who wanted to see how a forge ran when the hand at its center did not belong to the kind of person the world usually pictured there. Abigail never made speeches over that. She simply put work in front of them. Sometimes she let the girls hold the tongs. Sometimes she let them work the bellows until their arms shook, and they understood that fire answered effort before it answered confidence. Sometimes that was enough to change the course of a life before the life itself had noticed. Elias remained, not in the way stories make men remain, all grand declarations and polished promises. He stayed the way mountain stone stays, without advertisement, without asking to be admired for not moving when weather turns rough. He built a shed behind the forge first, then a stable proper, then a fence line stretching farther than either of them had imagined in those early days when surviving one season at a time felt bold enough. He hunted less as the years went on and traded more. Timber in winter, hides in late fall, game when the routes ran lean. He still left for stretches, as men like him sometimes do, following a season or a necessity, but he always returned with the same quiet certainty he had carried through the forge door that first day. No one in town called him a ghost anymore. Not after they saw him carrying feed in the rain, mending a split post at dusk, or standing in the forge doorway with a child tucked against one shoulder while Abigail worked steel at the anvil. The child came later, then another. Life, once it had chosen to root, did not do so halfway. Their first was a girl with Abigail's eyes and Elias's stillness. A child who watched before she spoke and understood tools before toys held much charm. The second was a boy born loud, broad-handed, and impatient with doors, weather, and any rule that struck him as built for weaker spirits. Between them the yard filled with motion, small boots through mud, mittened hands on rails, laughter cutting across the ring of metal, wooden toys abandoned near the water barrel, scraps of cloth tied around barn cats by little hands too loving to be sensible. The sound of children in a place once hallowed by grief changed everything. Not by erasing what had been lost, by proving loss had not won the last word. On winter evenings, the main room of the house glowed warmer than the old cabin ever had. Bread rose near the stove, salt pork crisped in the pan. Coffee thickened the air with that dark, bitter comfort that makes even bad weather outside sound almost useful. The children argued over biscuits. Elias corrected them with a single look more often than words. Abigail stood over the table, flour at her wrists, heat touching her face, And sometimes, only sometimes, when the room settled into one of those moments so full a body feared naming it might break the spell, she would think of the woman she had been on that ash-cold floor. Not with shame, not even with pity, with recognition. As if she were looking at an older iron pulled from the fire, seeing in its rough shape the first necessary blows of something no one else had yet understood. Spring came softer in those later years, not because the land had changed, but because the work that met it had learned how to bend without breaking. Snowmelt fed the troughs, the ground loosened. Hooves no longer struck frozen earth, but pressed into something that gave just enough to hold weight without throwing it back. The forge doors stood open more often than closed. Light moved freely across the work floor, catching on iron mid-heat, on tools worn smooth by repetition, on the steady rise and fall of a hammer that no longer searched for rhythm because it had become it. The sound carried out into the yard, across the fence line, into the road where travelers slowed without meaning to, listening just long enough to recognize the difference between work done for survival and work done with mastery. Abigail no longer rushed. That was the clearest sign of all. Where once every task had carried the edge of proving something, proving she could, proving she would, proving they had been wrong, now the work stood on its own. She chose her pace not out of defiance, but out of understanding. Heat needed time. Metal needed patience. Force, without direction, wasted itself. She wasted nothing. Orders came steady, sometimes more than she chose to take. That, too, was a change she had made without announcement. She turned work away when it would break the rhythm of the forge, when it would force her into haste that served no one well. Men who once would have argued learned not to. Not because she raised her voice, but because the quality of what she produced made refusal something they accepted rather than challenged. Halvor's name still passed through town from time to time, never loudly, never with the authority it once carried. He had not left. Men like him rarely do. They remain, adjusting to the shape of consequence the same way towns adjust to truth. Slowly, unevenly, but inevitably. He conducted his business, kept his books, spoke in measured tones, but the edge had dulled. The certainty that had once drawn a crowd now held fewer listeners, and those who did listen did so with more care, as if weighing his words against something they had seen with their own eyes and found harder to dismiss. He avoided the forge. Not entirely, but enough. And when he did come near, it was with a different posture, one that no longer assumed the ground would clear for him. Abigail never sought him out, never needed to. The work had answered him in ways argument never could. On a late afternoon, years after the storm that had shifted everything, a group of travelers stopped by the gate. Their wagon showed the strain of long miles, one wheel bound tight with a temporary fix, the iron band warped where it had taken a bad hit. The driver climbed down, hat in hand, looking at the forge with the cautious hope of a man who had learned not to expect too much from strangers. "You the one does the iron?" he asked. Abigail stepped out from the doorway, wiping her hands on a cloth, her gaze steady, direct. "I am," she said. He glanced once at Elias, who stood near the fence line mending a length of rail, then back to her, recalibrating without quite knowing how. "Been told this place holds," he said. Abigail followed his gaze to the wheel, taking in the bend, the strain on the spokes, the way the temporary fix had held longer than it should have. "It does," she answered, "if you're willing to hold with it." The man nodded, relief easing something tight in his shoulders. They brought the wagon in. Work began, as it always did, without ceremony, without the need to prove anything to anyone who stood watching. Later, when the sun dipped low and the last of the day's heat settled into a slow, steady glow, Abigail stood at the anvil with her daughter beside her. The girl's hands were smaller, her grip uncertain, but her eyes held the same quiet attention Abigail had once brought to the work when she had not yet known what she was becoming. Don't rush the strike, Abigail said, adjusting the girl's stance with a firm, careful hand. Let the weight do its part. The girl nodded, lifted the hammer, brought it down. Too light, too quick. The sound answered accordingly. Abigail didn't correct her with words. She reached for the hammer herself, lifted it once, and brought it down clean, the ring of it filling the space with a clarity that needed no explanation. Then she handed it back. Again, she said. The girl tried once more. Better, not right, but closer. That was enough. Across the yard, Elias watched, not interfering, not stepping in, his presence steady as it had always been, a constant that did not need to announce itself to be felt. Their son ran past him, chasing something only he could see, laughter cutting through the low, steady music of work and wind. Abigail struck again, then stepped back, letting her daughter take the space, letting the rhythm form where it would, not forcing it, not claiming it for herself. That, too, was part of the legacy. Not control, not ownership. Continuation. As the light faded, the forge doors remained open, the glow within steady, not flaring, not dying, just holding, heat contained, ready, patient. The town no longer questioned what stood there. It didn't need to. The answer had been shaped, strike by strike, season by season, into something too solid to ignore. And in the center of it all stood Abigail, not as the woman they had once measured and dismissed, but as the weight that held when everything else tried to give way. The world has a habit of measuring things wrong. It looks at size and calls it excess. It looks at silence and calls it weakness. It looks at weight and decides it must be a burden, something to be shed, something to be hidden, something to apologize for, before it has the chance to be named out loud by someone else. Abigail had learned that lesson early, long before the forge went cold, long before grief stripped her down to the bare truth of what she could carry and what she could not. They had looked at her and seen too much body, too much space taken, too much of a presence that did not fit the narrow frame they had already decided was acceptable. So they named it for her. Burden. And like most names given often enough, it had tried to settle, tried to root, tried to become the shape she moved within. But weight, real weight, does not ask permission before it reveals what it is. It waits, quiet, patient, until something presses hard enough to call it forward. The storm did that. The forge did that. The simple, brutal truth of work did that. Because iron does not care what a body looks like when it lifts the hammer. Wood does not care whose hands brace the beam when the wind begins to tear at the walls. And a life, when it breaks, does not ask whether the one holding it together fits neatly into the expectations of those standing at a distance. It asks only this: will you hold? That is the question everything eventually becomes. Not whether you were chosen, not whether you were prepared, not whether the world looked at you and decided you were enough before it placed the weight in your hands. Only, will you hold when it comes? Abigail had not answered that question in the square. Not with her words. She had answered it long before that, in the quiet places no one had been watching. In the way she stayed when leaving would have been easier. In the way she lifted when every voice she had ever heard told her the weight was not hers to carry. In the way she chose, again and again, to remain present under pressure instead of collapsing into the shape others had prepared for her. That is where strength is made, not in the moment it is seen, but in the long, unseen repetition of choosing not to step away. The town learned something from her, slowly, reluctantly, but they learned. Not because she demanded it, not because she forced them to look, because she became something they could not look away from, a truth too solid to ignore, that what they had called burden had been the very thing that allowed her to endure, that what they had mocked as excess had been the reserve she drew from when everything else ran out. That weight, carried properly, was not a flaw. It was foundation. And foundations are not meant to be admired. They are meant to hold. So the next time the world looks at you and decides what you are worth, before you have had the chance to test it for yourself, ask a better question than the one they've already answered. Don't ask whether you are too much. Don't ask whether you fit. Don't ask whether the weight in your life should be there at all. Ask this: when it comes down to it, will you hold, or will you step back into the silence they made for you?